Oh my gosh, I am so excited. So excited. This is my new favorite show. I immediately reached out to the showrunner, creator, executive producer to tell her how much I liked it. And now I landed an interview with her. Monica, welcome to Stand Up. I'm so excited to have you and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Pete. I'm excited to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about you before we get to the show and your career and your life, as it, I think, leads into and intersects to some extent with the subject matter here, because you grew up biracial in Philadelphia. Tell me a little bit more about your childhood.
Sure. So I've lived in LA for over 15 years, but I grew up in Philadelphia and I didn't dream of creating TV or anything when I was a kid. There isn't like a direct link from that to Manhunt, but I grew up in a neighborhood that basically at a time before I was born, the properties were hard to get mortgages for Black people and Jewish people. And there was a twins who were realtors who decided to figure out a way to work the system so that they could sell homes to Black families and Jewish families. And that was the neighborhood I grew up in. So it was a very unusual place in that it was very integrated for that reason. So we grew up not in the stereotype of what people would expect. There were a lot of upper middle class Black families. There were, I don't know, just a great mix of people, and people got along very easily. But then on the outskirts of that, 6 minutes from where I grew up, was a very impoverished neighborhood that was predominantly Black and had been pretty ravaged by the drug war and institutional racism. And then 8 minutes the other way, maybe less, was is one of the most privileged white neighborhoods, and then the suburbs and the main line that was pretty famous. So it was a interesting place to grow up, seeing such disparities so close together, and then but also seeing what it could be when those communities were combined. So it's hard to describe, but I think it was pretty unusual.
No, you're doing an excellent job. But what was it mean to you? How did it affect you? We've heard, I think, those of us who don't know folks who are biracial really well learned a lot from our former president, Barack Obama, who also, like you, went to Harvard, like Tom Morello and Mark Whitaker, biracial Harvard grads. I've learned a lot from them. But what was it like for you in terms of your identity?
That's certainly the first time anyone's put me and President Obama in a sentence. So I appreciate the company, but it's hard to sum up. I would, my therapist would say that it caused me for a while to both sides everything and not have an opinion for myself. I can see your point of view. I can see your point of view. But what do I want? So I worked on that for a long time, but I think that it's a best of both worlds in a lot of ways. I love Black culture and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I was raised Jewish. I'm no longer very religious or anything, but I don't know. I think in some ways it's a passport for being part of different people's communities. But at the same time, it can sometimes feel like you're not really a part of either because you're different. But at the same time, you have a lot of privileges. So there's not much to complain about. So I would say it's that. But I think in terms of Manhunt, my mom, she is white and Jewish, and she taught in the inner city underprivileged schools for about 40 years. And one school she worked at was all Black, and then the next school she worked at was a lot of recent immigrant students. And I grew up trying to understand why certain areas in the city were so destitute and so ravaged by poverty. And the more I learned about Reconstruction and what happened post emancipation, to me, I always saw a direct line that this was never anyone's fault or some kind of deficit in people's ethnicity or race, but that there must be some connection to the fact that we had slavery for so many years and then the disparity that we see in our country. So that was something that I was pretty aware of from a very young age and made that connection for myself and was surprised growing up that, and even as an adult, that more adults don't see that direct connection. So I think that was part of my interest But I didn't even realize that when I started the show. I definitely started writing the show because I was interested in the investigation of the Lincoln assassination, and the fact that was a true crime story I'd never really seen or knew about, which is surprising because it's one of the most famous murders of all time.
Yeah, if you like true crime, the genre, and apparently everybody does, it's not my thing, and I didn't look at this series as true crime, but it's a great way to pitch it because it's one of the most popular genres. It's exactly that in a way. I guess you just don't think about it. But you're growing up in Philadelphia. Obviously, you're surrounded by history, and as you mentioned, your background, your ethnicity, and the community that you grew up in. It's there. It's ever present. But like most Americans, even with your background, we didn't learn that much about most of this stuff in school, certainly not post emancipation and Reconstruction. Is that true of your childhood, your education?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think most of us are taught through the Civil War, and then most teachers skip ahead to World War One. So there's like a huge gap from the 1860s till like the 1920s.
Thank God.
That's
I feel like
weird.
I don't know what year the film Glory came out, and I don't know if it holds up. I feel like some have
It
criticized
does.
it as a kind of white savior. Matthew Broderick's role was
Mhm,
whatever, but
mhm.
I look at it as an educational film because I had no idea. I don't know if I didn't know that black men fought for the Union or why. Like that movie really, I think, helped educate me in ways that
Same.
I wasn't. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that movie completely blew me away and definitely left a huge impression on me. And I don't completely see that one as a white savior film because the guy that Broderick plays is a little bit inept. Like he's just a little bit in over his head. And I,
Yeah.
I actually think the soldiers played by Andre Brower and Denzel Washington are they come across as so impactful with their own agency, and those are 2 just indelible performances. Yes, that had a huge impact on me. Reading some books in school had an impact on me, and I think even when I was developing Manhunt, at some point I started bringing the Black Union soldiers into the story in episode 3, and a couple executives questioned me about whether it was realistic or not. So I looked it up and I found that there was about 180,000 African American soldiers for the Union, and I showed them the stat and everyone was really shocked. And so I think that you're right, that's something that just isn't portrayed. Most of the movies that take place in that time period or miniseries, you mostly just see white soldiers on both sides.
If people don't watch Manhunt, I feel like they're not good people because they don't wanna know. They don't wanna be educated about history, and I'm just teasing listeners, but the point is, I learned so much that I didn't know. It sounds like you did as well. But
Mhm,
just one more question about you before we get to the series, which I am so obsessed with and have been doing so much research since I watched episode 1, which you of course wrote, which is why entertainment? Like, why did this? At what point did you decide to do what you're doing? Go into writing? Was that your primary pursuit?
I was all over the place. I wanted to be an actor starting in high school. I went to a high school where we didn't have a lot of funding, but I had a lot of passion for performing, and Leslie Odom Jr. was in middle school at my school, and he was such a prodigy at that age. He would be in the high school plays even when he was in middle school. And so I loved performing. I pursued that in college, and then people were, "Hey, would you direct this or you wanna write something?" So I was like, "Okay, I get the hint. I'm better behind the camera." But I think acting for many years definitely influenced my writing, and I feel like does give me an edge in terms of seeing the different perspectives of the different parts and just scene work and stuff. I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, like a lot of things. But my senior year of college, I came across a photograph of a woman that was very stunning who was in one of my professor's offices. And I kept walking by it and being like, who is that woman? Because she's a black woman, but she's wearing like a very 1920s flapper kind of jewelry and like sequins and stuff. And finally, one day I just stopped by his office and I just said, "Do you mind telling me who that is?" And so he told me, and her name was Aida Overton Walker, and she was the first Black actress on Broadway. And I became really obsessed with her story and her company and what they were allowed to do and not do on stage as Black performers in the 1910s and early turn of the century. Anyway, so I ended up for my senior thesis writing a musical, like a play about them. And I convinced my professors to do that. I could do that instead of writing a paper. I really didn't enjoy writing papers. I love research. I love going to libraries. I would find little articles that were disintegrating in my hand. I love all that, but I am not someone who is good at footnoting stuff and making an argument and all of that stuff in a sort of academic way. So I think even at that point, I was very interested in turning primary sources into drama. And so that's how I started. And then worked for Manhunt too, because I used a lot of the trial transcript. I think a lot of people don't know there was a conspirators trial for the people who worked with Booth. I had never known there was a trial, didn't know anything about it. And it was this big deal. People refer to it as the trial of the century, even of the 19th century. That document, you can find it on Library of Congress website and other places, but it's about 1,000 pages long. And I honestly think that a lot of the reason why some of the myths about the assassination have lasted so long is that who's going to read 1,000-page document? Very few people.
What are some of the myths that you're referring to?
One that comes to mind is that Dr. Mudd was this unwitting doctor who just Booth just stumbled across and who he was just helping him and doing his oath to help.
After John Wilkes Booth assassinates Lincoln, he takes off and he's looking for a doctor. He gets treatment at
Yeah, he
Dr.
broke his leg. Yeah. There's a debate with historians if he broke his leg jumping off the balcony after he shot Lincoln, or if when he was on the run, his horse fell asleep and fell on his leg or something. There's disagreement about that. I can see both sides. I didn't wanna do the horse falling on him because it would involve a stunt that is dangerous for the actor and the horse, and there's a comedy to it. There's a sort of patheticness to Booth in that scenario, but I went with the balcony. Even though he was good at stunts, I just think with the adrenaline and everything, it just makes sense that he hurt his ankle.
The series is based on a best-selling book by James Swanson, Manhunt: The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer, and yet you take all kinds of creative license and to turn it into a TV show. Talk to me a little bit about how that works and how you did it, because you mentioned you love research. I didn't realize when I was watching it that it was based on this book. I was just like, did she just do a billion hours of research? But yeah, I'm sure you did anyway. In addition to the book, it doesn't adhere perfectly to that, does it? You took a lot of creative
No,
license.
the book is nonfiction and the show is historical fiction. And the book was very beloved and it's really useful in its research on the assassination night. So the pilot of the show, I took a lot of details from that. And then I would say it's also really drawn in terms of Booth's escape and the people he comes across and the capture at the barn with the cavalry. So those were the places in the book that I used in a pretty straightforward manner. But it's not really told with a protagonist and an antagonist. And I didn't want to center Booth as a white supremacist as the lead role and like the hero escaping or whatever, which the book is a little bit not that he's a hero. It's really focused on Booth's escape. I stumbled across the figure of Edwin Stanton, who was President Lincoln's Secretary of War, which is a position we don't have anymore. But essentially, it was like being in charge of the Pentagon and the FBI at the same time. So it's this giant building, huge department, and Lincoln worked there. He would go there every day and they would run behind the scenes the Civil War. That was like behind the curtain of the Civil War was in the War Department. He had a desk in there. He drafted the Emancipation Proclamation at his desk in there. So we might picture him being in the White House a lot, but in reality, he was spending a lot of his hours at the War Department with Stanton. And I've realized that there was no real sitting president from the moment Booth shot Lincoln and he was unconscious. He never spoke again until Johnson was sworn in the next day. Stanton was our de facto president for about 12 hours. And I found that scenario fascinating. And I was like, who is this man? Why aren't we taught about him? And then the more I learned about him is really like, why don't we know who this man is? Because he was such a warrior for civil rights, and he really put everything on the line to try to keep the agenda that they had just won the mandate for in the Civil War. Personally, he tried to save it. So that was how I found my way into describing the show and selling the show, was through him. And at the core, it's about avenging your friend's death.
Yeah, that certainly plays out really well in the series, and I love that there's all these flashbacks where you see Stanton and Lincoln talking together. I think it's probably one of my favorite parts. I can't say what my favorite part is. It's one of my favorite TV shows I've ever watched in my life. I'm obsessed with the era.
Oh, that's
I
really
I
nice. Thank you.
I love history, but the way this is written, the way it was cast, I can't say much about that. Really, that's really interesting. It's just so good. What is your role as the showrunner and executive producer in terms of how much of a vision that you have around something like the trauma, for example, like 12 Years a Slave or to Django and Chain or something. Some people might call some of that trauma porn. I've heard you talk about that phrase. We don't see that kind of trauma being put on the Black characters so overtly. Tell me why you made the choices you made for the Black characters specifically.
Yeah, I think in recent years there's been a bit of an exhaustion from the audience in terms of wanting to see a more dynamics, or like a bigger cloth of roles for Black characters. And I'm not in the camp of I don't want to see any more stories that take place during slavery. I'm not in that camp at all. But I do feel that, and I have observed even people on my crew who have, I had makeup and hair people who have worked on a lot of those movies, and they personally would come up to me and say thank you for doing it a little bit differently, because we respect and admire all of those other productions, and I do as well. But sometimes it can just be so painful to experience it and see it and be part of it, and you're doing something a little bit differently. So that meant a lot to me. And so what I did was I tried to take a little bit more of a Hitchcockian approach. So in episode 5, one of our favorite characters, Mary Sims, who's played by Lovey Simone, who hopefully if you're enjoying the show, you're really with her character, you're really rooting for her. She was a figure in real life who worked for Dr. Mudd as his slave. She kept house for him, is how she described herself in the trial transcript. And she, in the trial transcript, she refers to being beaten by Dr. Mudd. And I wanted that part of her story in the show, but she's so amazing and you're so with her. I just couldn't stand actually seeing that or making the actress go through that. So what we did was we allude to it, and then the way I wrote it was that the door closes and you just hear it. And so I'm proud of that, because people have actually even reached out to me, messaged me like, wow, that I've never seen it done that way. And I
Yeah,
really,
I so appreciated that. I was the last person to see 12 Years a Slave. I'm joking, but as a white man, I knew I didn't wanna watch that. I don't like to see that. I watched it, but eventually, but I don't wanna I know they happened. I just like the way that you did it, and in case any listeners haven't seen it, it really is done, differently. There's a scene after Lincoln is assassinated when I think the Black soldiers find out and others. And I thought it was just really interesting to think about. And I hadn't really thought about this, not only what it meant for everybody in the country, but what it specifically meant for Black people when they found out the President Lincoln had been assassinated. Was what was this going to mean? Were they going to go backwards into slavery? It was just after
Mhm.
he surrendered. It was just after the war was over. His bloody
Yes.
so I thought that was such an important scene, and it plays out throughout the series. What did we how much of did you think about the reaction of Black Americans?
I was curious if people would watch the show differently and have different stakes in mind as they're watching it, and I'm really happy that a diverse audience has found the show and enjoyed it. That information was another surprise for me. I did not know that Lincoln was assassinated 5 days after Lee surrendered. I had no idea the timeline was the same week. I was under the impression Lincoln's a two-term president. He was basically there for almost 8 years. Like, I don't know why I assumed that, but I did. And that was shocking to me. And I was like, wait, how can we not interpret the assassination as a direct response to Lee surrendering and an attempt to trying to reverse the result of the war? And again, I don't know why we aren't taught it with that framework or that timeline. I wasn't. I don't know if you were, Pete, but that opened up a whole other lens or context for it. And then the other huge surprise was that there were multiple attacks the night of the assassination, that it wasn't just this lone wolf Booth shooting Lincoln in Ford's Theater, but that there was an attack on the Secretary of State,
Right.
William
I
Stewart.
had no
Did you
idea
know
about
that?
that. I stopped. I pressed pause. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Monica, but I pressed pause many times, but certainly then I was like, "Wait, what?" They went after other cabinet secretaries and people whose names I had heard of, but I never knew they were almost killed.
Yeah, it's wild. It's so strange how it's just been put in the shadows, and I don't know why it's been withheld from us.
Isn't it because of who writes history?
Say it again?
Isn't it because of who writes history?
Possibly. I don't know, but I don't know why people would not want us to know that the government was almost toppled that night and just
Yeah.
it's not like it's not in the books. Like it's in the history books. If you read something about Seward, it's there. But in general, in our collective conscious, in our mythology, in our culture, I don't think it's a well-known part.
The one of the other things, and I found this, I think it was in the final episode, when I learned how I know a few of my friends went to Morehouse College down in Atlanta, and historically Black college, and probably, I don't know, one of the most popular, Howard and Morehouse. Morehouse is white. What? I was like, "Who is Morehouse?" He was a general, and the one scene I think where we get to see him, or maybe a couple
Oh,
actually.
that's Howard, General Howard.
Yes, I feel like that I had no idea about that either, and
Yeah,
it's
same, and it's hard to see in the shots, but he was also an amputee.
right.
He had no arm on one side. I can't remember if it was from the elbow down or shoulder, but he ran something called the Freeman's Bureau, which also I don't think a lot of us know about, but there was actually a department that was I think it was part of the War Department, but basically it was a whole department to try to help freed people gain a foothold in society from having nothing to being citizens. And they would also help former slaves find family members since so many were separated. So they would have places where you could try to reunite with your brother or your son or your mother, and they would help with trying to provide food, education, and job training. So that was something that Howard ran and Stanton was a part of overseeing. They were just really ahead of their time. Stanton, even, I couldn't show this as much as I wanted to, but he hired a lot of disabled veterans to work in the War Department and gave them jobs when they couldn't get jobs elsewhere. So he would find something for them to do in his department. The Freemen's Bureau run by Howard, I had no idea about the that it existed. I had no idea that Elizabeth Keckley, who was a gown designer, who's African American, she was a trailblazer and she made gowns for Mary Todd Lincoln. She had her own kind of separate, what we would call now a nonprofit organization. She was a philanthropist and she had something called the Contraband Society. Contraband was a name at the time for freed people. And so she was running sort of her own Freeman's Bureau and getting donations from people to help people who were coming up to DC after slavery. It was just really beautiful to me because sometimes people can say, "Why don't people help themselves?" And I really thought it was important to show that we have always been trying to help each other and help ourselves and try to if someone gains a foothold, trying to put a ladder behind you to help other lift other people up. And seeing how all of that framework, institutional framework fell apart with President Johnson, I think has been very moving for the audience. And
Yeah, that was the last thing I was gonna ask you, and I'm sure you don't want me to minimize any of the characters, and you didn't create them, but you wrote around them and introduced them to us, but I feel like Andrew Johnson was a real piece of shit. Sorry.
yeah, pretty much. It's hard to find something redeemable about him except that he wasn't Confederate and he believed in preserving the Union.
I guess my last easy question, I hadn't seen you answer this. Did you get any first of all, I know that you had the job responsibility of hiring a lot of people. I know you hired a lot of women and a lot of black folks to work on the crew and so on, and I think that's, obviously important. But how dare you, I don't know if you had anything to do with the hiring, hire 2 Brits to play 2 of the main American roles, both John Wilkes Booth and Secretary Stanton. Did you get any grief for that? I actually don't care about that thing at all, but did anybody were like, "Hey, you hired British actors?"
Uh, Anthony is from Northern Ireland, so I'm not sure he would
Forgive me. Oh,
identify as
sorry, Anthony.
British, but I know what you're saying. Yes, I did almost all the hiring. That's a big part of show running is choosing all the department heads from costuming to production design to casting and music. So yeah, I know people have an issue with that on different productions, but I just think of this as like a global world of artists and people from other countries, Australia, Ireland, they're really good at accents and they're also really convincing in period stories. A lot of them are classically trained. And I think that Anthony is one of those actors, he plays Booth, Anthony Boyle. Stereotype of actors from the UK is that they're very cerebral, and the stereotype of American actors is that they're very instinctual, like a Robert De Niro or a Raging Bull and Anthony's one of those actors who can completely do both. He can be so physical and so passionate and emotional, but you can also give him I gave him Edgar Allan Poe, and he reads
Yeah,
it beautifully. So he's incredible. And then Tobias, he has an incredible work ethic and ear. So I knew he would nail the American accent. He is so before this, he's seen as so quintessentially British
right.
and even playing royalty. So I just thought it would be such an incredible challenge to see if he could convince the audience that he was completely not
Yeah,
that. And he nailed it.
I didn't see what was the other show he's popular for, but I watched him in The Crown playing what Prince Philip, Queen
Mhm.
Elizabeth's husband, and he was great. But watching him in this, it was when I was so pathetic. I was tweeting everybody, first you and then him. I was like, "Yeah, I like you." But he was so good, so good. I couldn't take my eyes off him. All right, last question. There's so many
Thank you.
more.
That role was a labor of love for
What would you say, please, if you don't mind, to my daughter Ava? She's 19 and she wants to be Monica Beletsky when she grows up.
oh, that's very
Any
sweet.
advice for a young person entering the entertainment industry, a young woman, if you will? What
Mm.
did you do right or wrong or that helped?
There's so many winding things that influenced my life that made it possible for me to do it and survive it and thrive in it. It's hard to pinpoint, but even just like growing up with boys, I would say was useful. I had a brother. I grew up with a lot of boys in my neighborhood. I hung out with a lot of boys after school. It's a very male dominated business, and it's a little less so now, and probably by the time she's a professional, it will be even less and it'll be more there will be more equity, but I've been in multiple writers' rooms where I'm the only woman and the only person of color in the room, and so I think having a good sense of humor, having I don't know, I think the main thing in this business is patience and endurance. I think that it's probably taken me twice as long to get a show as some of my male colleagues, and I think that it hasn't been to do with talent. I think that women are still under trusted with ambitious material And I think that hopefully that's changing. But my advice would just be that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, and that you have to enjoy the process of it and the collaboration and the community, make friends who are interested in the same things as you, because they will be
Right.
probably the people who are working and hiring and, want you to be on their crew if they're making a short film or any of that, as opposed to, hoping that someone's going to pick you out of the sky and see your talent. So that's what I would say. And then I would also say try to work with the type of people that you want to be. So, if you can get a job doing research, I have someone who did research for me. I was doing various biopics that needed a lot of research. So I had someone who worked with me for 2 years helping me with research. And we just had a rapport. I had a sense of trust, and then they were one of the people I hired to be in my room. So I would say find your community of your own age and then try to work with people. But then my last piece of advice would be to just live life, because I meet a lot of writers who have only been on a desk being an assistant to a filmmaker, and then they want to be a filmmaker and they don't necessarily have a lot of stories to tell. They
Right.
don't necessarily have a lot of life experience. So like when I was coming up in writers' rooms, there's 16 characters, let's say, on Parenthood or Friday Night Lights. I probably had 15 odd jobs when I lived in New York City trying to make a living. When they were like, "We need an odd job for the daughter," I was like, "How about this? How about that?" So
That's
I
really,
do think that living life is important for writers.
for any creative person. As a stand-up comedian coming up, I didn't have much of a life. I had such an easy, privileged life growing up. Material, and I was an autobiographical comedian, didn't come easy for me. And I decided I needed to do weird, different things to be able to write about. And I remember it was before the internet. I went on a blind date because I'd never been on that. And I was like, that could be material. And then I actually started going to see a therapist, not because I had problems. I just thought maybe this will help. I heard of comedians going to therapists. And
Did this date and this therapist know that you were just material, that they were material for you?
I didn't want to tell you this, but I started dating the therapist. No,
That's
great,
material.
great guy. Neither of us had ever been with a man. No, nothing. She was a woman, actually. No, yes, I think they did know. I think they did know. Maybe the blind date didn't, but
I'm
it
gonna
was
think
so
twice
long.
before I start dating a stand-up comedian now that I know it's, fodder for material.
Oh, no, you're never going to date a stand up comedian. I care too much about you hardly even knowing you to tell you that. Maybe Patton Oswalt. He's married, but he was in the show and he was
Yeah, no,
so,
he and
so
his
good.
wife are awesome.
I will let you go. I'm so grateful that you joined me, but I'm much more grateful that you put this out into the world for all of us. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to see whatever you do next. I hope I'll get to talk to you about it, but I'm a monster fan of your work now, and I'm really grateful to you for joining me.
That's very nice. Thank you, Pete. It was great.